Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com and welcome to my JavaScript functions masterclass. So basically, I've done videos on functions before, but they're all in little snippets and pieces, so this kind of brings everything together from beginning to advance on working with functions. The best way to think about functions, I'm wrapping up something that I'm going to want to do multiple times in a variable. Okay? So this is why I like arrow functions, which if you're a beginner, you don't know what that is yet, because it helps distinguish the idea between a variable. So I have my JavaScript variable. So we'll call it my func, where I'm going to store my function, versus the value, which is a function. So this pattern right here is a function. I could literally just pass this in there. So that's it. That's all I'm putting in here. This thingy here. And when I go, if I were to console log this variable and say my func, let's see what I get. And see, there's a function that's stored in that variable. Okay, so a function is a type of data. It's a type of data you can store in a variable, but but the way I think about it is like a recipe. It's like a recipe that you store inside of a variable. Okay, you're saying, hey, I have this recipe of something I want you to do, and I want you to bake the recipe whenever I tell you to. Okay, and then generally here, well, we'll talk about this in a bit. We'll come back to that. But in the brackets, that's where you put the actual directions, the recipe. So in this recipe, we're just going to console.log I was baked, in the sense the recipe was baked. Okay. So the recipe is saying, hey, I did my thing. Now, let's watch the difference. When I do my func, like this, it doesn't run the actual recipe. It doesn't run the directions that I put inside the curly brackets. Because, like this, it's just saying the value of my func. And the value of my func is a function. And that's what it says. There's a function in this called my func. So in order for me to bake the recipe, to sit there and say, hey, go do the thing, I have to invoke the function. So whenever I call the function variable, I got to put a parentheses after it, and that basically says, go do it. Go bake the recipe. So now if I do this, see, now it actually does it. It console logs I was baked. But now it says undefined. That's weird. Why is it doing that? The reason is what console log so basically this console log runs fine. I was baked. But this console log wants to print whatever's here. But when a function is run, the only thing that's there is whatever that function returns. And right now, this function doesn't return anything. Okay? It doesn't return anything. Okay? And really, this is the function. This is just the variable we store the function in. Okay, so this is the recipe. And right now, the recipe, all it does is print something on the screen and never gives me anything back. So if I wanted to actually, instead of me console logging it, maybe I want to give it back so that way this console log can do the work. So then what I would do is instead of console logging this string, I would return the string. I was baked. And then what this does is that anytime I run this function, it gives that back. So literally, putting this here is the same thing as just putting in I was baked. Okay? So that's what returning is. You're saying that this function is going to give something back when it's done. And that's what this console log is going to print. Whatever this function gives back, whatever it returns. So now if I run it, see? Now there's only one line, because the only time it console logs is on line 5, and it's going to console log the return value of my func, which is I was baked. And then I can do this. And this is why you want return values, because now you can actually manipulate those return values. I could do something like this. Since this returns a string, well, typically if I have a string, I can then go ahead and split that string. Oh. I can go ahead and split that string. Okay, and now I'll have an array of every letter. And now watch what happens. If I console log this, Now I have an array, I was baked. Okay, because what's happening is first this function runs, it returns I was baked, so it's like having the string I was baked here. Then we chain a string function, split that string. Okay, now if I want to take this even further, I can then, now that I have that, okay, now that I have that, what I can do then is then rejoin it. But then if I want to add like a space in between each one, I'll just do this. And now I'll have the same, I'll have the string back, but except I'll have a space between every letter. See, I'm just chaining on these functions. Because this returns a string, and I'm allowed this, and this is a split is a string function. The split returns an array, which join is an array function. You can join it into a string. So I'm chaining off the return value of the previous function. That's why it's important to understand return values, because if you know what a function returns, then you can start chaining off the corresponding functions off each other and doing a lot of cool stuff. Okay, because basically these chains just keep playing off the return value of the previous function. So now, see, I was baked, but now there's a space between each letter because we took the string, we splitted it, but then we recombined it with a space between each one. Cool. So that's kind of a fairly technical example of showing you how to work with the return value of a function. But neat. But that's not very exciting. It's always going to return I was baked. That's the same thing every time. That's not super exciting. So functions get more useful as they get more dynamic. Okay? So what would be, and for it to be more dynamic, I got to pass it information. Okay. So if you want to make your function more dynamic, you need to pass in data to it that you don't know is going to be passed in yet. So that's what's called a parameter or argument. So a parameter will be the placeholders we'll put here. So that's where this thing comes in. Here we can define parameters that will be used in the function. And all a parameter is information we do not know yet. I don't know what this is going to be. So we're going to say num1, num2. We'll keep this real simple. Num1, num2. And now I can use num1 and num2, even though I don't know what they are. I just don't know what they are yet, and do something with it. So let's say I'm going to take, there's two pieces of data. I don't know what they are yet. They're going to be passed in, num1 and num2. And I'm going to add them together. And I want you to return the result of adding them together. So basically what this function is now doing is saying, take whatever the first value passed in is, make it num1. Take whatever the second value passed in is, make it num2. And then fill in the function here. So now, if I were to do this, my func, now in my invoking parentheses, I can then pass an argument, which means I pass values. So I'm going to say I pass 2 and 3. So essentially what happens now is that when this function runs, 2 is going to replace num1, 3 is going to replace num2, and this becomes 2 plus 3. Okay, and so 2 plus 3 is going to return 5. So then 5 gets returned from the function, and this console log will then console log the 5. So if I run that now, see, you get 5. And now I can keep changing the numbers and I get different results. 6, 3, so 6 plus 3 is going to be 9. And that's how functions really start becoming much more useful, because now you can have something that you're going to do, but you might do it with different pieces of data and just throw them in a function, and it just comes out nice and ready for you to use. Cool. So that's pretty straightforward, and literally any kind of information can be passed in here. So I could pass in 2 strings. So I could pass in, make this 6 and 3 as strings, and it will still return a value. The only difference is that since they're strings, it's going to give me back the string of 63 because it's just going to add the strings together. Okay, 63. I could pass an array. So I'll pass an array as the first value. So an array of 1 and 2. I'll pass an array as the values of 1 and 3, 3 and 4. As the second value, see, the array is treated as one value. Okay, and then if we add those together, what it should do is it's just gonna end up coercing this into a string, I'm pretty sure. So it's just gonna see a string that's the two arrays combined. So it should be like 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 5 actually as a string. Let's see. I think that's what's gonna do. Yep, 1, 2, 3, 5. It just coerces both arrays into a string because of the way I added them. Okay, I could put in an object. So let's say we put in an object and name Alex, and then into the second value I'll put another object, age 34. Okay, save. I think this will do the same thing where it's just going to turn both of them into strings, but let's find out. Oh, that one just broke it. Okay, let's see here. Alex is not. Oh, this needs to be a string. I always keep doing that. I am not a variable. I am a string. Okay, there we go. Yeah, and then that's even weirder because basically, way Node will do it is it just does that. Okay, so, but I can pass them in. I can pass anything. I can even pass in other functions, but we'll come back to that. So basically, it just makes the data available to the function, and I can do whatever. So in this case, where I have two functions, I mean two objects, I could do this instead. I could just do num1.name if I know that this is how the object will look like. And that's the thing. You have to kind of have an idea what you plan on passing in, and that's important to document. This is where things like TypeScript become really useful, because then you can write a function and actually type the return values and type the parameter values, so that you can actually sit there and say this should be an integer, this should be an array, so that way somebody else who uses your function can see that in the actual function definition. But it is what it is. Okay, but in that case, save, and then in this one, the num2, since num2 would be the second object, I want to access the age property, so it'll combine Alex and age. So just say Alex 34. Let's see here. See, Alex 34. Just turns the 34 into a string because you're adding it to another string. Cool. Okay, so that's a function. Okay, now next thing to know is that there's different ways to write a function. So this syntax here, okay, is referred to as an arrow function. Okay, so just to kind of get rid of all the extra stuff so you can see there's just the pure syntax. And see what you're doing is that this is the function and you're storing the function in this variable here. That's not the only way I could define a function. Another way I could do it is I could do this. Get rid of the arrow. And then I would add the word function here. So when I do this, it's just saying, hey, this thing next to this thing coming up is a function. And same thing, I would put in my parameters here. So I could put in my num1, num2 here. Num1, num2. And then return num1 plus num2. Okay, and then if I were to just, function still gets called the same way, so we'll just say 1 and 2. Save. This is the same thing, just a slightly different syntax. Okay, so let's say 1 plus 2 is 3. And then the other way I could do this is I would delete all this. I wouldn't even declare a variable. And I do this, function myfunc num2. So in this case, there is no equal sign. This is sort of the original way of doing it. And basically what it is, it's just a wrapper around that whole variable thing. So essentially, really what's going on is just saying, hey, we're going to create a variable myfunc that stores this function in it. Except it just doesn't show you the equal sign, which doesn't, it's just basically doing it as a bundle. But it's literally the same thing. So if I run the function again, I still get 3. So there's 3 ways to write that function. There's a couple differences between the second two and the arrow function. The arrow function is different. It has some sort of optimizations. The only thing you really lose when you use the arrow function, which isn't that big of a deal, is what's called the arguments object. So theoretically, I could go here and pass in as many arguments as I want. Okay? And I don't even have to define my argument. I don't have to define the parameters here. Okay, what I can do, and just to show you this exists, console.log arguments. This is just this magical thing that exists inside those functions. Okay, and then we'll just say return whatever the first item is in that array. Okay? So I could sit here and name a bunch of numbers, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. See, just a whole bunch of, pass in a whole bunch of arguments. Okay? But notice, I don't have parameters to fit all those arguments. So what's going to happen? In this function, it's just going to get passed into this arguments array. So watch what happens when I run it. Oh, some typos. Unexpected token return. Oh, I put return twice. Save. You can't return. I'm breaking JavaScript's brain. Okay, there we go. And you see, there's this arguments array that has all these arguments. And then the keys are just the number. Okay? There's actually no, and then that's another key point. It's actually, notice I'm going to get 1, so that works. But notice it's not really an array. It's a weird argument, and not just any kind of object. It's an object. It's a special type of object called arguments built into JavaScript that works kind of like an array. Which, yeah, that's a thing. So you could do that. There's other ways you can, but in an arrow function, so if I were to change this back to an arrow function, const myfunc equals arrow, this arguments thing doesn't exist. So now if I run this arrow function, see, it's all like, what are you doing here? It doesn't know how to handle this whole arguments thing. Just gets really confused. Okay? Like, it kind of has an arguments object, but it's doing something else. Like, it's not doing what you think it's doing. So you can't really use that in that, but it really doesn't matter. There's a really easy workaround. So if I wanted to do the same thing, I could just basically, expect that an array is put in with all your information. So I could just pass in, or Control Z, pass in, make this an array, pass in an array, and you can pass in infinite amounts of information, and then, I will just we'll call that array my R, that'll be the name of the parameter, and then it just works the same way. I just have an array with all my values, and I'm just going to return the first value from that array. Save. Oh. Save. Let's see. I get my array values and 1. So, I mean, the loss of the arguments object isn't a big loss, because you can just pass in an object or an array or a map or pretty much any kind of collection variable with infinite amount of values and accomplish the same thing. It's just before you had it built into those other types of that other syntax. So that's the other big thing. The other big difference is the way it treats the this keyword instead of an object. For that, watch my objects masterclass video. I get into that. I don't want to get into that again here. It just gets too into the weeds. But the moral of the story is there's 3 ways to define a function. For the remainder of this video, I'm going to be using arrow functions because I think they're the best way. They're just, I think, syntactically, functionally, a way to do it 90% of the time, personally. Okay, cool. So we've pretty much gone over what you can do with functions. A couple other neat things are things like recursion. Recursion is the idea of using the function, having the function call itself instead of using a loop. So first let me show you how I could use a loop to do the same thing. So let's say I pass in a number, and I just want to console log the number. So I'm going to console.log. So what I do is I will do a for loop for I equals 0, as long as I is less than the number that we pass through, I plus plus. We will console.log the number, that current number, starting with 0. So now I could just go pass into the function like a number like 9, and it'll print out 0 through up to 9. So let me make this less than or equal than, because I want to print out the 9 as well. So if I do that, oh, syntax, what did I do? Let's see here, missing after, oh, missing parentheses. Save, let's take a look around here. That all looks good now. Save. Okay. Then I run it, and see, it prints out 0 through 9. But again, it returns no value, so what I will do, actually let's do this. Let's make this back to thinking what I want to do. Okay, now let's do this. Return num, and that's how you'll get the 9 back. I'll keep this here. It really doesn't matter. Save. Okay, so basically it prints out number 1 through 9, and then I get 9 a second time because it returns the value in this console log here. Or what I can do is I can just get rid of this console log, so I don't need the return value at the moment. Okay. Cool. So that's just a loop and a function. Now I can loop whenever I want. But another way to loop using a function is what's called recursion. So let's try to do the same thing, but instead what happens, there's no loop. Basically what happens is we're going to say, we're going to check, does the num equal 0? So num if, because you have to do some sort of check to make sure that this loop is over. So we're going to say, is num equal to 0? Okay. If it is equal to 0, we're going to return 0. Okay. If it is not equal to 0, what you're going to do is we're going to console log the number so that we can see the number on the screen, num. But then it's going to run the function again, my func. And my func is going to take in a parameter of number -1. So what's going to happen is it's going to keep doing it. So first it'll be passing, I pass in 9, then it's going to pass in 8, then pass in 7, then pass in 6, then pass in 4. Keep doing until it hits 0, and then at 0 this whole chain ends. Okay, so basically we should see the same effect where it's going to console log, except now it's going to count backwards. It's going to be like 9 to 0 because of the way I created it, but it's the same idea. But it's looping without a loop. This is referred to as recursion. So see, 9 through 1. Because again, it just keeps running the function inside of itself over and over again. But if you don't want to create an infinite loop and just break things, you got to make sure there's some sort of check on when that chain of calling itself ends. I usually avoid recursion. I find it hurts my brain more than just doing a normal for loop. But where recursion really shines is when you're working with like trees of objects. You know, like let's say like the DOM, and you want to like to change all the DOM, having this like function that goes and sits there and goes, okay, let's go take a look at this element. Are there any elements inside of it? Okay, run the function on that element, so that way it sees if there's any elements inside of it, and it just kind of works its way through a tree. That's a really useful place for recursion, because a loop's not really going to quite do that. But that's really advanced stuff. But this way you understand the idea of recursion, the idea that a function can call itself, and you can actually loop by using a function. Again, 9 out of 10 times probably a loop will be easier to think through, but in certain situations you might actually be able to get a pretty efficient outcome using recursion. Okay, so that's recursion. Other cool tricks. What if you wanted to return multiple values? Okay, there's a couple different ways you can do it. This is again, because in some languages like Go, you can just define multiple return values and return multiple things. And then you just, so basically it would just be like return 5 and 6. And that's what would happen. But no, in JavaScript, it's just going to end up returning the 6. But what if I need both numbers? Well, then what I would do is I would just return the array. Okay, I'm going to return the array 5 and 6. I'm going to take out the parameter for now. And then the way you can use array destructuring to grab those two values. So I would just be like const 1, 2 equals my func. Because if I know that this function is going to return these two things, then I can just destructure that. So it'll be like, okay, this becomes 5, this becomes 6. So you can use destructuring going in and out of the function. So when I'm pulling the values from the return value of the function, so I could do this as an object. So if I wanted to do like an object like this, so it returns an object called 5. Well, actually, we'll just say 1, 1, 2, 2. Okay, this would still work, except I have to change these to curly brackets. And then what it'll do is it then looks at the return object and says, okay, the property of 1 gets assigned to the parenthesis, the 1, and the property of 2 gets assigned to the variable of 2. So that's called destructuring. If you want to learn more about that, watch my destructuring masterclass. You can also use this in the parameter list. So for example, something really fancy. What you could do is something like this. Const, well, let's see here. I'm just going to do this. I'm going to pass in an array. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And let's say I wanted to recursively iterate over this array. Okay. I could then use destructuring right here in my parameter list and say, hey, this is item. So whatever the first item in that array that's passed in is going to be called my item. And then the rest of the values, I'm going to store in a variable called the rest. So I'm using the rest operator and destructuring. I'm actually destructuring the variable going into my array, which is really cool. So then, kind of like we were doing before, I'll just do this. If the length of the array, so we'll say if the rest dot length, because again the rest is going to be an array. It's just a smaller array because I pulled out one item. If the length of the array is less than 1, so if it ever hits 0, then we're just going to return return 0 or return true. That's done. That's fine. Okay, and if it's not 0, okay, we're going to console.log the item, whatever the current item is, and then we're going to run the function again. My func we're putting in the rest. Okay, so basically what happens here is the first time this array goes in, 1 is going to get assigned to item, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 gets assigned to the rest. The array's length is not 0, so then we run the function again. So 2, 3, 4, 5 gets passed in, 2 gets assigned to this, 3, 4, 5 gets assigned to the rest. Then it's going to run again, 3 goes here, 4, 5 goes here, and it'll just keep doing that recursively. Now I can recursively loop that through that array. So this is just a really fancy way to show you that you can use destructuring and recursion to do cool stuff. Let's see, it just iterates over the array. It doesn't do number 5 because when 5 becomes the item, the array is 0. So let me see here. Let's make it greater than 0. Okay, or greater than or equal than 0. And let's see if that does the trick. I'm not going to play with it right now. But you guys get the idea. I can destructure whatever goes into my parameters, which is neat. And I can destructure it on the way out, as we saw before. So that's a lot of cool stuff. The last thing to talk about functions is passing in functions as a parameter. You can do that. So const my func, and that's referred to as a callback, equals, and then I'm just going to say here a func as a parameter. So that's a function that may get passed in. Again, you don't know what's going to be passed in. but we're going to assume that it will be passed in, and we're just going to use that function. So I'm going to invoke this mystery function, because again, it's a parameter. This is just a placeholder. We don't know. I mean, if I pass in a number, it'll just be confused. A func, okay? And that's all it's going to do. It's going to do whatever this function does. So my func, now, here's the deal. If I were to pass in, you know, something like 5, it's going to try to invoke 5 and just error, because 5 is not a function. So you see, a func is not a function because I didn't pass in a function. A func is now the number 5. But if I pass in a function, and again, a function is just this. Okay, I could pass that in, and it'll run it, but that function doesn't do anything. But it'll work, so the code won't error. So let's see here. See, the code ran, but the function doesn't do anything. Let's actually make the function do something. Console.log. I'm alive! And if I do that, okay, see, console logs I'm alive. Because what happens is that it's passing through. This is a function that's being passed through. So this little clump of code replaces a func, and then we're invoking that function. Ta-da! So that's a thing you can do. That's referred to as callbacks. A lot of functions. You may not necessarily use callbacks a lot when you're designing a function, but there are a lot of libraries you will use that will ask you to pass in a function. And I don't have to pass in an arrow function quite like that. I could define the function separately. So I could just make another function, const the func. We got the func. We got the func. This is basic. I'm literally doing the same thing, just slightly differently. Instead, I define this function, and it's console.logs. I'm alive, or it's alive. And then instead of writing this arrow function as my argument into the function, I just pass in the function itself. So then the func becomes the value of a func. It gets invoked, and the function runs. So basically, it should just console log it's alive. Ta-da! Okay, it works. Neat. So you can call functions and functions. You can pass multiple functions as parameters. You can pass arrays of functions as parameters. You can literally do anything you can imagine. The idea is that once you built that function, you can then pass whatever you want to pass into it and call it as many times as you want. Okay? And that's what makes functions really, really useful, because I can take something I want to be doing a lot and encapsulating it in a function and just calling it as I need it. And that's really, really, really cool. Trying to think if there's any other fun function stuff that, I mean, functions can return anything. They can return objects, they can return arrays, they can return other functions. Okay, so I could literally say, you know, literally, if you ever use React, when you use the useState hook, it's returning you an array with a value and a function that you're destructuring. So, and if you're not familiar with that pattern, in React, you'll use this thing, and it's like state, so that's like your value. Then useState, which is a function you use to change that value, and then you would do like equals this function called useState, and then you would pass in a value like 5. And essentially what this function is doing, it's giving you two things. It's storing this value of 5 in this variable called state. And then it gives you a function called useState that allows you to change this variable. And here we're using array destructuring, and it gives it back to you as an array. So basically the first value of that array is the state, so it goes whoop, pooch. And then the second value is the function, so it goes whoop, pooch. So you can do really cool stuff. Okay, I'm just saying, like, that's one example. You're just seeing like that kind of, you know, returning a variety of different data pieces in an array, and you're destructuring that return value as an example. And I mean, if I'm starting to lose you here, don't worry. This is more very advanced stuff, and if you don't know React, you have no idea what I'm talking about right now. Okay, so that's fine, but functions are powerful, and I think we kind of covered all the really cool nuts and bolts. The only last thing I'll point out is that you can do something like this. You can actually just define define a function without a variable, just in the middle of your code like this. So console.log I work, and you can just invoke it right away. So I just put 2 parentheses right afterwards, and I literally I'm invoking this function. It's kind of like if this function had a name, and I put 2 parentheses after it, I just immediately invoked this function, and this will run. Well, let's see here. Unexpected token. Where did I screw up here? So console.log I work. It's not liking that there. There's a way to do it. I forget. One moment. Got it. If you want to do this with arrow functions, you got to wrap the arrow function in a parentheses like this. So let's see if that works. Save. Yep, and that works. So that's the only difference. And this is also referred to as an iffy, because it's an immediately invoked function expression. You're basically just doing the function once. You're not saving it in a variable. You're not calling it later. You're not passing it as a parameter. You're just running it now. I've never been in a situation where I've needed this. I'm sure there is, and I think there used to be more so before certain additions to the language. But this is a thing you can do, just so you're aware. I think at this point now you've kind of seen just about the full breadth of what can be done with functions. There's also cool strategies you can use, especially when it comes to like object construction, as far as using functions. But for that, watch my video on factories or factory functions. So I'll see you guys later on. Have a great day and enjoy.